Hello, Math Studies students, and welcome to your online lesson. Today we'll be continuing our discussion of systems of linear equations, and we'll once again be using technology to solve those systems. This time we'll be using something on the TI graphing calculators known as the PolySmlt app. And we will know we are successful when we can efficiently solve systems of linear equations using this technology. A reminder about linear equations. A linear equation is an equation that when graphed forms a line. Generally they will have two variables, often x and y, but they don't have to always be x and y. And a system of linear equations is when we have two or more equations that when graphed at the same time intersect each other, meaning that there is a single point or a pair of x and y values that will solve both equations, both systems, both equations in the system, or both simultaneous equations, meaning they work at the same time. Last time we looked at a way to solve a system of linear equations using a graphical method on the TI-84 graphing calculator. And this time we'll be using something known as the PolySmlt, or on a newer calculator it would be called the PolySmlt 2 app. And so poly stands for polynomial, and what a polynomial is an equation essentially with multiple terms. Down below we can see something with something in standard form where we have an ax, a by, a c. Those are all separate terms. We could have even more terms like in a quadrilateral or something with a cubic or something along those lines, but we'll be mostly looking at linear equations again. SMLT, or SMLT, stands for simultaneous. So we're solving simultaneous equations with multiple terms. That's what PolySmlt is standing for. So these apps are allowed on the IB Math Studies exams. And there's a similar function that comes standard on Casio calculators, but we'll be again looking specifically at the TI-84 or TI-83 calculators with this. Now, in order to use the PolySmlt app, you need to get it in standard form. And what I mean by standard form, we looked at this a couple videos back, but we need to have a coefficient a in front of our x, and that could even be 1 if x is by itself. We need to have a coefficient b in front of y, and they all need to be on one side of the equal sign, and then a constant, or c, on the other side, and that would be the number that is not attached to a variable at all. Generally in standard form, the a and the b terms are whole numbers, but in our case they don't have to be whole numbers. We just need to make sure that we get them to one side and that the c is the constant on the other side. So previously when we did our graphing technology, we wanted to have y by itself, similar to slope-intercept form, which is also a great technique for substitution. Here we want it in standard form, which is often what we'll use for elimination when we're doing it by hand. But again, we'll be using the technology here today. So on the next screen, we will look at an example. So our first example, we have two equations, y equals 4x plus 6 and y equals 2x minus 2. We want to find an x and y value that work for both of these equations. These equations, unfortunately, are not in standard form because the x's and the y's are not on the same side. That's a relatively easy fix. So the first equation I'm just going to rewrite here as y equals 4x plus 6. And now I want to get my x to the other side. So I'm going to subtract 4x from both sides. Okay, I'm going to bring down my 6, bring down my equal sign, leave a little extra room for both my x's and my y's. Normally we put the x's first, and I'm going to do that. You'll notice there's a negative in front of the 4, so that sticks with the x. The y was not negative, but I'm combining these terms, and we're using plus because it was positive. So y minus 4x or negative 4x plus y are the exact same thing. And again, to have it in standard form, x needs to be first. All right, now our second equation, we've got y equals 2x minus 2. I guess I can work right below it here. Again, I'm trying to get my x's and y's to one side. Y is already on the left. I'm simply going to move my x's over there as well. So my x's cancel out. I have negative 2x as the coefficient, or negative 2 is the coefficient of x, and then the y was positive. Bringing it down, the sign in between would be plus since it was positive. And then I have a negative 2 all the way on the right side. All right, now it's a matter of getting this into our calculator. So once again, we have our two equations. Our second equation's here. our first equations here, and we don't need to look at the originals anymore because we've rewritten them in essentially standard form. The reason I say essentially is there is a negative in front of the x, which would not be typical in standard form, but as long as we have the x's and y's on one side and they're in that order, we're good to go. So the first thing we want to do on our calculators is go to apps, and that is about 3 rows down and 1 column over. It's got a special color on it. Most of the keys are white. So that's our apps key. And I have a lot of apps on this calculator. They're in alphabetical order. Most of these would not be allowed in an IB exam. But again, I'm looking for PolySmlt or PolySmlt 2. This calculator is a little older. It has PolySmlt 1 on it. PolySmlt 2 is maybe even a little easier to use, but essentially the same idea. And so I'm going to hit enter here. Problem starts up. And you'll notice we have 6 different options here: polyroot finder, simultaneous equation solver, about, help, so on and so forth. We want the second one. We want the simultaneous equation solver. So I'm going to hit number 2. And the first thing it asks is for the number of equations. And in this unit, we'll only be dealing with 2, though this could be used for more equations, but we have 2 here. And then it's the number of unknowns. Well, unknowns is our variables. And we have an x and we have a y. So that once again is 2. And you'll notice that just by arrowing down, it automatically filled in a number 2. So now I'm going to hit enter. And it puts up a little matrix here. And basically what it's looking for are all of my numbers in each of the equations. So I'm going to start with the blue equation. And it wants the coefficient of the x. It wants the coefficient of the y. And it wants the constant. So essentially the numbers that are in front of the variable. Well, my number in front of x, which is always what we start with, alphabetical, is -4. Notice I hit an actual negative with the 4 rather than a -4. And I can hit enter after typing that. You'll notice that it jumps over to the next spot on the first row here. And now it's looking for the coefficient of y. Well, y is by itself in this blue equation. But how many y's do we have? We have 1 of them. There's an implied 1 as the coefficient. So I'm going to hit 1 and then enter once again. And then finally for my constant, that is the 6 that I'm looking for here. So I hit enter 6 and then enter for that. So I have -4, 1, 6, which are these coefficients, -4, an implied 1 in front of the y, and then a 6 as my constant. Now we're going to do the exact same thing, but this time for the red equation, my second equation. And my coefficients this time, -2, an implied 1, and -2 for my constant. So I can type those in. -2, enter, 1 for my y, and -2 again. Notice once again I'm using the negative symbol, which is at the very bottom of the calculator next to the decimal point, not the minus sign. You'll get an error otherwise. And I've put all this stuff in now. -4, 1, 6 for my first blue equation, -2, 1, -2 for my second equation. And it doesn't do anything if I press enter at this point. What we need to do is, you'll notice up here it says solve. And that's what I want to do. So you're essentially hitting the graph button, which is right next to the solve. And so I hit the graph key. And it gives me my x and my y. Well, my x of 1, it says, and x of 2, essentially my 2 variables. But in our case, that's an x and a y. So we have -4, -10. And if you look back on either of our previous examples from the other videos where we solved the same problem, we got that same exact solution, -4, -10. All right, moving on to our next example. For our second example, you'll notice that they already are in standard form. We have 2x plus 2y on one side of our first equation with an equals 5 on the right. So our x and our y are already on the right side. They're already in alphabetical order. So this example should be a little bit even easier for us. So our first step is we need to quit out of our previous app. So I'm going to press second and then quit. And now I have a blank screen again. So that was second, and like the mode button, or right next to it is the quit. And now I'm going to go back to apps. I'm going to scroll down to PolySmlt. Hit enter. I want the simultaneous equation solver, so I press 2. It says number of equations. It's defaulting to what I had previously, which is 2. So that's good. 2 variables, so I'm going to hit enter and then enter again. Now I need to clear out everything that was in here previously. So you can type right over it. I'm just going to hit a 2 and then hit enter. And then I have a 2 as my coefficient for my y, hit enter. And then finally I have a 5 as my constant. Goes to the next line. I have a 1 this time, a single x, 1x implied. hit enter, -6, I hit the negative sign, and then the 6, hit enter, and then a +6 for my constant. Once again, if I hit enter, nothing happens. So I need to go to solve. So I hit the graph button, which is right below the solve, which displays on the screen. Hit graph. And I end up with my first variable, which was our x, being 3, and our second variable, which is our y, being -5. So we have a final ordered pair, or -0.5, I'm sorry. So we have an x value of 3 and a y value of -1/2, which again, if you remember back to our previous videos, example 2 always came out to 3, -1/2. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is using the PolySmlt solver. So hopefully we have a better idea of how to use the PolySmlt app. We'll have an opportunity to apply that in our next class. And this lesson refers to section 4I from the Orange textbook, and you can find additional problems and examples there. Till next time.